Well, here it is, the end of January, and you might remember that we started out this month talking about how January really offers us a very welcome opportunity to pause and relax a little bit after what's usually for most people a very hectic holiday season, and just take some time to contemplate what we want to see for our lives in 2015. And I used a gardening metaphor for this because it works so well, I think, in this part of the country. I just noticed this morning that our neighbor's huge magnolia tree is just about ready to pop. And when that happens, that's, for me, the beginning of spring. We have a really short winter here, something I've come to appreciate after living all those years in the Chicago area where it's ice and snow up until March and sometimes April. January is about it for the really cold and dark times for us out here, and then it all begins to change. The days get longer, it gets a little bit warmer. In February, it's literally time to start tilling the soil and planting the garden. There's a lot of things that can go in the garden in February, which means January is the time to envision, to dream, to plan. What do we want in the garden? What do we want in the garden of life? Metaphorically and in reality, both kinds of gardens. The garden of life. What do we want for ourselves? What do we want for the world? What do we want the garden of life to look like? Now, there's someone that I know that you've all heard of who asks that very same question each year. Every year in January, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation publishes an annual letter. This is something they've been doing since 2009, and in this letter, they give a vision for what they want to co-create in the world. What it is that's going to improve life for everyone. It's a big vision. And we all know who Bill and Melinda Gates are. We've probably heard of this charitable foundation that they set up back in the year 2000 with a little help from their friend Warren Buffett. Bill Gates, sometimes known as the king of the nerds. I would imagine during those cruel adolescent years, there were probably plenty of people during his teen years that were poking fun at him, calling him a nerd, a geek, and all those kind of things. And that just brings to mind this wise old saying that the best revenge is a life well lived. And there's a modern corollary to that one, which we can see up here. Be nice to nerds. Chances are you'll end up working for one. The foundation that bears his name had an endowment at the end of 2014 of $42.3 billion, with a B as in boy. So let's hear it for the nerds. That's nerd power in action. So every year the Gates Foundation puts out this letter setting forth a challenge or an initiative that they want to tackle. And as I said, they're always thinking big. And this year, along with the letter, they've released an animated video. And this little video will give us the gist of what they're proposing in just about a minute and a half. So Jacob's going to bring that up now, and let's watch it.
In our annual letter this year, Melinda and I are making a big bet.
The lives of people in poor countries will improve faster in the next 15 years than they have at any other time in history.
We're putting our time, resources, and credibility behind this bet and asking others to join in.
There are 4 reasons why we think this bet will pay off for the world. Health will improve dramatically. The number of children who die will drop by half and will eradicate 4 diseases in the next 15 years.
Africa will be able to feed itself. Improvements in farming will mean the continent won't have to rely on imported food.
There will also be fewer famines, and when they do happen, African countries will be more prepared to step up.
Online education will reach hundreds of millions of people. Teachers and students from Canberra to Chicago will connect with world-class learning materials and each other online.
Cell phones will bring mobile banking and payments to the most remote areas, allowing people to save what they earn or borrow what they need cheaply.
For this bet to pay off, we're counting on one more thing:
people. We believe that in the coming years, people will expand their circle of compassion
from their family and their clan to their country, their region, and the world. Giving will go further because fewer people will be desperately poor, and more people will be in a position to help others.
We want to break the cycle of poverty, and if we all work together, we bet it can be done.
So there it is, short and sweet. That is their big bet. And as they say, they're putting their money where their animated mouths are. They're putting their money, their effort, and their reputation behind this. This is a 15-year time frame that they're proposing, within which the lives of people in poor countries are going to improve faster than at any time in history. That's the promise. That's the bet. And did anyone notice they're not asking for your money? Isn't that interesting? I'm sure they'd accept donations, but they have quite a bit of money already. So this whole thing is beginning from a position of abundance, from a consciousness of abundance. And that's what really struck me about this video when I first watched it. What is said to me is that it is indeed a question of consciousness. And you heard about that toward the end of that video. If you go online and read the entire letter, and I've given you a link in the handout in your bulletin, and not if you go online and read it, please do. Go online, read the whole letter, and see the kind of detailed ideas that are behind it. This isn't just fantasy and pie in the sky. Read it, and then maybe, pass it along. Share it on Facebook or Twitter, or tell people about it in any way that you can think of. When you read the letter, though, when you get down to the bottom, the only thing that they are asking of all of us out here is to become what they're calling a global citizen. A global citizen. And I love that little part in the video where they talk about the power of people who are willing to expand their circle of compassion from their family and clan to their country and their region and ultimately the world, and of course beyond that. That's something I talk about all the time. When I talk about evolution of consciousness, it's all about expanding our circle of caring and compassion. And now this is a message that we're hearing from Gates Foundation and other outfits out there in the world. So they call it becoming a global citizen. Here's how they define what becoming a global citizen means. Becoming a global citizen doesn't mean you have to dedicate your life to helping the poor. It does mean you follow an issue of global importance, whether it's one we wrote about in this letter or another, like human rights or governance. You take a few minutes, once in a while, to learn about the lives of people who are worse off than you are. In fact, if you're still reading this far into our letter, you are probably a global citizen. You're willing to act on your compassion, whether it's raising awareness, volunteering your time, or giving a little money. Those are the options, but that's not what they're leading with. In other words, you don't have to turn your life and schedule upside down in order to be a part of this in a very meaningful way. Once we start to genuinely care about what happens to people who don't live here, who don't sound like us, or look like us, when we start to genuinely care about those folks, great things can start to happen. I always like to start the new year on an optimistic note. So that's what this is all about. We need something positive and specific to counteract this constant undercurrent of negativity, pessimism, and cynical blather that we read and hear about every single day. There are way too many alarmists and fearmongers in the world. And I'll tell you what, doom and gloom do not motivate, and they do not inspire. Nobody wants to hear about how our children are doomed because we've screwed up the planet, and by golly, it's too late to do anything about it, so enough of that. And people look at hunger, they look at poverty, disease in the world, and they say, well, what can we do? There isn't enough to go around. That's the problem. There isn't enough to go around. That's just the way it is. And you know what? You get enough people starting to talk and think that way, and sure enough, that's the way it will be, guaranteed, and that's the reason why things are the way they are. It's called lack consciousness. Lack consciousness. Coming at things from this attitude that there isn't enough, there's never enough. But does it really have to be that way? Well, not according to one of my favorite authors, Unity minister Eric Butterworth, who wrote a book. You're familiar with Discover the Power Within You. Well, there's a couple other wonderful books that he wrote. One of them is called In the Flow of Life. And he says that the only way to counter lack consciousness is to stick to principle. And he says this: in a time when the world is facing the grim specter of lack, there is a great need to understand the omnipresence of divine substance. There is little question that people can fail and even go hungry in their experience of life. But the great truth of the reality of affluence is that there is a legitimate abundance for every person, which one can and must claim for oneself, and that lack of any kind in the human experience is the result of some kind of obstruction of the free flow of the creative process. The creative process. So, with that quote in mind, I went back and looked at the Gates Foundation letter for 2015, and what I saw in that letter is the creative process in action. They are co-creating something, and they're asking us to join in, at the very least in consciousness, in co-creating. It's the co-creative process in action based on the absolute certainty that there is, right now, an abundance of compassion and physical resources in the world that are sufficient to turn things around in a 15-year time frame. Now that's what I call a positive message. And even though it didn't originate with Unity, it's something that works right along with that vision that we have of helping to co-create a world that works for all. They're focusing on 4 things in the letter, and these are some of the highlights. They're saying that by 2030, the world is going to be healthier. And you may have noticed they're talking about especially for children, because they're the ones who suffer disproportionately from poverty and hunger and disease and those things. And they're also the ones who are they're helpless to do anything about it. So in our world, which we sometimes call the Western world, over here, the death rate for children under 5 has been well under 1% for quite some time now. That's our world. In the rest of the world, in the rest of the underdeveloped or undeveloped world, the mortality rate for children under 5 has been around 10%, over 10 times higher than it is over here. Now, that was in 1990, and since 1990, that number has been cut in half. So it's around 5% for people in the underdeveloped areas of the world, and the goal here is to cut that number in half again by 2030. It's a lot of lives. You know, we don't think much about polio in this country, do we? I personally don't know anyone who has had polio. But in other parts of the world, it's still a major problem. And again, it strikes children at a disproportionate rate. Well, they're predicting in the Gates letter that by 2030, polio will be eradicated because vaccinations are going to be reaching more and more people. And totally eradicating a disease is a really big deal. The only time it's happened before is with smallpox, and that happened in 1980. But the naysayers are at it already, telling us that, well, if we eradicate disease, how are we going to feed the people who would have otherwise died? That's a pretty cynical attitude, isn't it? Well, here's how. Another part of the big bet, and you saw it up there briefly, another part of the big bet is that by 2030, Africa will be able to feed itself. All of the tools and technology of modern agriculture, the things that make it possible for farmers over here to produce, I don't know, it's a huge number of times more than they do in Africa. All the tools and technology are there to make it happen. The problem is that it's not reaching enough people, and it's not reaching the right people. The tools and the technology are only getting to the male farmers. They're only getting to the larger commercial operations. The idea is to extend those educational opportunities, get that information in the hands of women and smaller farming operations, because women in Africa do at least half of the farm work, and they get none of the education and technology. They get none of the benefits of agricultural extension, which has made such a huge difference in this country. Now, if you leave half of the world's population out of the equation, do you think you're going to get a good result? Makes no sense. Half the work and zero resources is unacceptable, and that's what they are striving to change. And the key here is that they've identified the weakness, and they know now where to focus the resources. So closing the gender gap here is crucial. And here's what they say about that. Education. It's the great leveler. And this is when a young woman gets an education, it has a powerful ripple effect. As an adult, she'll earn more money. If she has children, they will be twice as likely to live past the age of 5. Her daughters will be twice as likely to go to school themselves, and the cycle continues. This isn't just pie in the sky. Plenty of details in the letter about both the challenges and the proposed solutions, and why those proposed solutions are worth betting on. And again, the pessimists and the cynics might just be inclined to dismiss it all. Like I said before, oh well, just a lot of happy talk and fantasy. I mean, after all, how could such sweeping change be brought about in just a mere 15 years? Well, to answer that question, the Gates Foundation has enlisted the support of a noted skeptic. This is a guy who refuses to take any claim at face value, who questions everything. He's a scientist. You've heard of him. His name is Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's the man behind the remake of the TV show Cosmos, and I have another short clip where he answers the all-important question of exactly what is possible in 15 years. Let's watch.
For me, the cosmic perspective is, here we are on this spot called Earth. But the cosmic perspective enables you to step back. So I have no problems with 15-year horizons. In 15 years, we went from no space program in the mid-1950s to blueprints on the moon. I remember the day that because that was made possible, in our minds, everything else was possible as well, on the same or shorter time scale. If we're going to bet what 15 years from now will look like, will there ever be the end of war? Perhaps. The end of hunger? Perhaps. But you have to envision it first. You have to bet on it. Then you're invested in the outcome. That's where change comes from. What does it mean to be alive as a human being with our capacity for thought when you're thinking, where's my next meal coming from? And do I have shelter over my head? Poor people, particularly in developing countries, sometimes don't have the luxury to think about the universe and our place within it. Everyone needs to share in that thought. I would say 15 years to solve world hunger and poverty. It took less time to get to the moon.
Okay, how about that for a perspective?
Yeah.
Took less time to get to the moon. I remember that. Going from no space program in the mid-50s to, as he said, boots on the moon. A shift in perspective, and all things are possible. But First of all, you have to envision it first. Bet on it, and when you're invested in the outcome, that's where change comes from. And if I didn't know better, I'd say that Neil was, once again, quoting our friend Eric Butterworth, who said the same thing in another great book he wrote called Spiritual Economics. He calls it the law of visualization. Having seen and felt the end, you have willed the means to the realization of the end. We create the condition in mind that makes the result inevitable, and the way we create the condition in mind is by having a clear statement of the vision that we're bringing into reality. So, if anyone thinks that unity principles aren't at work in the world doing great things, think again. And then go read the 2015 Gates letter and get on board. See you next week.